and welcome to Aspects of Writing. I'm your host, James Kelly, and my co-host for today is Joyce Gatchenberger, and the topic of the show is Encouraging the Writer in You. Our guest is Rhonda Gatlin, and Joyce, please introduce Rhonda for us.
Absolutely, I'd love to. As James said, Rhonda K. Gatlin's heart and soul is firmly planted in the South. Rhonda was born in Tampa, Florida, attended high school in Montgomery, Alabama. She received her Bachelor of Science from Auburn University and her Master's in Literary Arts from Lesley College. She stayed in the South to teach elementary children for 14 years. Rhonda then moved to Boulder City, Nevada in 1989, where she resides with her husband, Chris. Rhonda's son, Ryan Osborne, granddaughter Jade Parker, and grandson Oliver Osborne live in Alabama, where she often visits. Rhonda retired after teaching an additional 25 years at Andrew J. Mitchell Elementary School in Boulder City, Nevada. In 2016, Rhonda received the American Graduate Champion Award from Las Vegas Public Broadcasting System, PBS, for her active role in making a difference with children through teaching, reading, and writing in elementary classrooms. Rhonda has written 2 books in her series, Granny's Cobbler, a counting book, and Aggie's Purple Hands. She is working on her 3rd book in the series.
Thank you for being on the show today, Rhonda.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So what inspired you to write this first book?
Well, the first thing was that when I retired, I didn't really know what I was going to do with myself. And so my brother called me one day and he said, Rhonda, I was praying this morning because he's a pastor and this had a little bit more emphasis for me. And he said, God told me to tell you to write a book. I went, write a book? He goes, Rhonda, you've been writing all your life. You've been teaching writing. You've been doing writing stories. You wrote one for your granny on her 100th birthday. Come on, you can do that. So I got out all of my writing and I went, okay. So this particular story, called Aggie's Purple Hands, is about me as a little girl around 6 years old, and I wanted to help make scuppernong jelly. Now, scuppernongs are not a grape that you would find anywhere. It's down in the deep South. And so we really liked scuppernong jelly, so I wanted to help.
Can I interrupt a minute? Can you look at the camera and say that scuppernong jelly again? Because as you know, it's a Southern issue. Okay.
And so scuppernong jelly is what we really enjoyed eating and always loved Granny's scuppernong jelly. And so this time I wanted to help. I was 6 years old and I was big enough. So they said, okay. We'll see what you can do. So first we went out and we picked the grapes. And my brother Roger and I both had our own little basket. Everybody else in the family, Granny and Papa and Mama and Daddy, had their baskets. And we picked, but Roger and I stopped and played pirates for a little while. And then we picked, and finally we had our basket. So we went into the house and took our baskets in there, and then we were shooed outside. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I thought I was going to get to help. So I sat in front of the back door waiting to be called. And so I finally was asked to come inside. Could I read a part of the book?
Sure.
Okay. Mama put Aggie at the far end of the kitchen table with a small bowl and a potato masher. Aggie climbed onto the kitchen chair and got up on her knees so she would be high enough to mash the grapes. She mashed and she mashed and she mashed, but the grapes would not stay in the bowl. Every time she pushed down, a grape would pop out and roll onto the table. And every time she'd scoop it up and toss it back in.
And you know what I like is we're talking about encouraging the writer in you. And what you've done is you've taken a part of your history, your life growing up, and you've just woven that into this book. And I can picture a kid sitting there with the potato masher
Yes.
trying, because scuppernines are not small. They're fairly large. They're
Yes, they
about
are.
twice the size of a regular grape.
Yes.
So I can see you trying to smash those grapes, and they're just going out the
Rolling
side of the
everywhere.
bowl. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
So what I did, I won't read it, but I'll just tell you, is I asked Mama to cut a hole in the middle of the cheesecloth. And then I put it over the top of the potato masher, and it covered the bowl. And I was able to give them
Right, because now
squishy
they couldn't
grapes
come out of the bowl.
because they couldn't come out.
Yeah.
Good
So-
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, growing up, you grew up in the South. I lived in the South 12 years. So I'm very familiar with the scuppernine if no one's ever heard of them. I know, Joyce, you said you had not till we were talking about
I
it
had
before we went
not,
on
I
the
knew
air.
gooseberries, but not scuppernines.
Yeah.
Well, we had a great big arbor in the backyard of Papa and Granny's house. And it was a terrific place to play and also a place to pick the grapes and make jelly.
So what you did is you took a childhood experience
I
and
did.
wrote a book about it.
I did.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I did when I was a teacher. I taught for 39 years in elementary. And I would read something. And then what we would do is talk about, for example, if I read about a pet octopus. Okay, so I would read about the pet octopus, and then the children would expand on that. They would either write about another octopus and how they dealt with that octopus, or their dog, or they would talk about their cat or their hamster. And so then they made it their own story, but they kept the basics, which would be about a pet.
Right.
And so then they would write it, and then we would look at it and edit it, and then they would make it into a little book. And then we would stamp it and say published. And so then they would draw pictures to go with it, and then we would have a time where they got to go to the captain's chair and sit up there and read their story.
Joyce, you were a teacher as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I was. I was a teacher before I was a nurse, and I was a nurse for 35 years. Yes. I taught preschool, kindergarten, and first grade. Yes. And I understand what she's saying about being someone who encourages reading and writing in young children. It's a fascinating look on their face when they get the fact that they can actually tell a story. Someone will listen to them, and their imagination gets open. Yes, you're right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I taught second grade for 25 years, my last 25.
Oh,
And
It's a
that was in
magical
Boulder
age.
City. And, I loved second grade. They were so open to taking your ideas and taking them further. And they were at that point where they could read and they could follow along. And, their writing sometimes was not to the point where they could spell things correctly, but you knew from the way they phonetically spelled it what the word was. And so at the editing process, then we would sit down and talk about, okay, read this to me. Okay, now let's see how we really spell this word. And we would look it up in the dictionary. And then they would write it down correctly.
So you were encouraging the children to write.
Yes. And we would do different things. Like, for example, one time I had a beach party. Kids wore their swimsuits, and they had done poems, the acrostic poem about an animal or a sea creature. And so we had a beach party. They wore their swimsuits. They brought their towels. The parents came, brought their umbrellas, and we were out in the pod and had the microphone, and the kids each got to read their poem. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And
that
the
sounds like
kids
fun.
really, enjoyed that.
So as an adult, then that child would remember that experience, and then that was something they would write about.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing, my book, as far as memories, when a grandparent would read this book, they could think back about their memories and they could talk about the things. Remember when I was a little girl or a little boy your age, and I remember that my granddaddy took me and I got to ride the tractor, or I got to go to the circus with my granddaddy, and then they could write about the circus. So, one of the things in my blog that I say is to, especially during the summer, to give them extra activities to do, is to work on talking to them about your memories and let them take their memories and write.
So, Rhonda, do you know if any of your students went on to ever become either an author or write for magazines or newspapers?
I know that there are several of them that are still in high school that may be on the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few that have done that. And there are a couple that have been in college that, they've talked about literature as their major.
Okay.
But as far as actually knowing someone that has written a book yet, no, not yet. But I'm sure there's someone out there that's going to do that.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of fun to think that. I know when I was growing up, I think back at my teachers, and I did have a high school teacher who called me in for counseling in the summertime. She invited me to her house to talk about what should I be doing and where I should go with my literature. And
Special teacher.
Yeah, and it was
Yes.
kind of interesting that she wanted to talk to me about that because I didn't think I was that great a student. So it's amazing that people can influence you that you're not even aware of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're right.
That's
You're right.
true. And I think that because of the different activities that I did with the children,
Mm-hmm.
that it helped to bring out the creativeness in them. We didn't just sit there at the desk and write. They might take their clipboard and go and get in a corner,
Mm-hmm.
or they might even write under their desk.
Yeah.
And we had writing workshop. And so maybe one day they worked for 30 minutes, and then I would call, okay, we got to go on to something else. They would put it in their folder. And then the next day, when we had writer's workshop, they would take out their book and they would start writing again where they left off. And if they decided that that wasn't what they wanted to write about, then they would change. But the first thing we always did is talk about what can I write about, and make a list of all the different things. We even had a book that each person had that they decorated, and then they would take it with them sometimes out to recess. And then they would look around and they would write about that tree. Or they might put down something about the jungle gym or the swing or something like that. And then they would come back inside, and when we'd have writer's workshop, they'd go, I was outside and I was on the jungle gym standing, right on the edge. And I said, oh my gosh, you were standing? Oh no, not that close. And then they would say, but I hung upside down. I said, well, write about that.
Yeah.
And so then they would.
Mm-hmm.
One thing we did is we did portraits where they chose a person, and then they would write a story about that person, made up, nothing about going and looking up information, but they'd have a picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would take that picture and they would go, okay, I see this little boy. He's got a bat in his hand. He must be going to go play baseball. And so then they would say, okay, I'm going to write about baseball. So it gave them a jumping off spot, gave them something to look at and say, okay, I can write from that. I wrote a short story just not too long ago about fire dogs, about the Dalmatian. And I had a picture of these Dalmatians, which was a cartoon, and they were all on the fire truck. And so I took that story and looked at that picture and I went, oh, well, I'm going to have Oliver, which was my grandson's name, and I had the Dalmatian named Oliver that was driving the truck. And they went to Miss Kitty's house because her house was on fire. And so Miss Kitty was up in the window going, help, meow, meow, meow. And so then, I took the story from there and wrote about what happened in the story. So I think that pictures do tell a lot for children.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I go, I use a lot of pictures too.
But even for a fiction writer, the visuals oftentimes stimulates the mind when it comes to wanting to create something.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book called The Alien Transcripts, and that came from watching a documentary. And I observed the people in a region, and they were talking about the depletion of the rainforest, and I observed the primates of the rainforest. And then they would go across the world to the different rainforests that were being depleted, and I would notice similarities between those primates and the people of the cities. And then from there, I started questioning, okay, but if you believe in creationism and not Darwinism, then this wouldn't make sense. And my story was born from that whole premise of what if they collided? What if they're both accurate?
Mm.
And that's how the story was born. So it was a visual that I saw that actually created the idea in my mind, here's a story, here's something I can write about. Obviously, I took the liberty to go way out there on tangents, but the point is that
That's
it's
the
the
writer
visual.
in
Yeah,
you.
it's
Yes.
the visual. And if you can do that with anything, the Purple Caterpillar, which is my children's story, that one really wasn't so much as far as visual as depression.
Depression.
It really was. I wrote that in 1 hour, and it was one of my downfall years, and I'm sitting there by myself. My family's back home, and I felt sorry for myself, and I have no idea why I wrote a children's story out of depression, but I did. And so, and you can take anything in life and turn it into something positive.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Even your deepest, darkest moment, if you
Mhm.
just allow yourself.
Mhm.
And a lot of times I think if people do that, I think I know of one other writer who writes from his dark side. And it's okay to do that because oftentimes that can brighten your day. That can actually turn it completely around.
Well,
'Cause
James, one of the best books, like you were saying, one of the best books for children comes from when children are bullied. One of
Yes.
the best stories and one of the best life stories comes from when someone writes a book geared towards children to tell them how to deal with the issue of bullying. And that's such an issue now in society, and it always has been.
And that's what the Purple Caterpillar really is about.
Yes, and I've read your book, and it's such a great book on that subject. I know you say depression, but bullying goes right in with that book.
No, I'm saying I was depressed when I wrote it.
I know, but
But maybe that's why I started thinking about life in general. And when you look back at life, that's a good point.
Mhm.
Maybe it jarred some memory or something that said, why someone made fun of me this way or someone picked on me that way. And so I turned it into something positive. It's not a dark book at all.
No, it isn't.
But it did come from that inner self,
Mhm.
In fact, it's kind of the opposite of that, really.
But it's a positive, happy book
Yeah.
for children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's kind of what you've done. You've taken an experience in your life and you've turned it into something that's positive and encouraging. And like when you're talking about when she was trying to mash the grapes and couldn't figure it out, now you become inventive. Now you got your mom to put the cheesecloth over the top, and that way the grapes wouldn't come out while you're smashing them. I mean, we can learn so much from just thinking about life in every aspect. Your book
Yes.
is from life's experience.
Yes, it is. All three of them are, yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But so how were you encouraged to write those books? Did anyone encourage you, or did you just decide on your own to do that?
Well, my first book, which started the series, which called Lines of Listening, is a true life experience of my family's experience with living in a dysfunctional environment. And the impetus for it was my discussions with my family. And when you live in a dysfunctional family, the first thing you learn is don't tell the secrets. No one tells the secrets about what's happening inside the family. So the secrets are to be kept. Whatever the issue is, you don't tell it outside. So as you grow up, you're supposed to keep those secrets, even as adults.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided that to go on in life, to make yourself positive in life, to go on as an adult and be what you're going to be, you have to examine the secrets. To examine the secrets, you have to tell the secret. And the writer inside of you has to write about the secrets. That's just what you do as a writer. So to write about the secrets, you have to talk about the secrets. So as I wrote, I had to talk to my family about it, and that led to discussing it intimately with my family, writing about the issue, putting it down on paper, and that led to publishing the story.
Did anyone encourage you to go forward with it in the family?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not, because you tell the story and you put it in writing and you put it out in public. So I was disowned by my family by publishing the book.
But there's got to be something that's inside you that encouraged you to continue as a writer. I mean, because
Yes.
you've written 2 more books since
Yes,
then that are
yes.
part of this series.
Yes, absolutely.
So
And
something.
it gets into you, once you write, it gets into you to write more because it's very freeing, it's very positive, and it encourages you to be more free. It helps you develop as a person.
What do you think,
Absolutely.
Rhonda? How about for you?
Well, because of the fact that mine are happy memories, my granny and papa were very important in my life. That's my mother's parents. When my daddy got sick when I was 6 months old, they came and got me and took me to their house. And I was there for a good 3 months at a time, and then I would go back for a little while, and Dad would get back in the hospital, and I'd have to go back and stay with them. So I spent a lot of time with them, and every summer for 6 weeks, that's where I wanted to be. So I had my own set of friends in Hartford, Alabama, and I, did church. I did the friends. I even sometimes got there when school was still in session, and I would go with some of my friends and spend the day at school. Same thing when I graduated and started teaching. I would go and visit the classrooms and work with the kids back then, all the way at the beginning of my teaching.
And we have a very similar life because from age 5 on, I spent 3 months out of the year with my grandparents, and then I would spend 9 months at home. So I always had the same. I had the same experience as you did. I actually made my first cake from scratch at age 5, so I can relate to this so well. It's amazing. And back then, you didn't have the box cake mixes like you have today.
Oh, no.
You really did have to make it from
Yes,
scratch.
and Granny made the best pound cake. Oh, my goodness. Yes, and I got to
Memories.
help with that.
So taking those memories, you can really create some wonderful things with those. And I
That's
think they're
right.
great tools, like you said, to use to encourage and teach others with. And I always look at those 3 months. Those are the sane months out of my life every year. The rest, not so much. But,
The rest not so
the
much.
3 months I was with my grandparents were just
Yeah.
blissful.
Well,
It was wonderful.
As I found out, that was my stability because my father moved me all over the place. I mean, I went to 5 different elementary schools. I went to 2 junior highs. The only place I got to finish was in Montgomery, and I got to go 10th through 12th grade. And so I was always having to go make new friends. I was always having to go and learn the new places and do things. I lived in Alabama, Mississippi. I was born in Florida, lived in South Carolina, North Carolina, several places in Mississippi. And my next book is about Hazelhurst, Mississippi, which was my junior high years, and the group of friends that I had there. So that's the one I'm working on now. So it's also a true story. And then, of course, I'm taking a little bit more leeway as I get on in my writing to add things that not necessarily are true in the book.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Mrs. West is a ghost.
Yeah, that's definitely
And
taking a stretch.
So,
Mhm.
you know, and so I'm working on that. And then my first book, Granny's Cobbler, was taken from Granny and I making blackberry cobbler.
Mm-hmm.
And we would go out and pick the berries, and we would come in and wash them and put them in a container. And the next day we'd go out. And in the book, I took 25 each day for 4 days to get to 100. And then we made the cobbler. And I also put Granny's recipe in that book.
I was going to ask you too. Even in this book here, you have lessons in there, like math lessons and
Yes,
stuff.
I
that
do. My daddy was real good with math, and so while Mama and Granny were washing the grapes and picking off the stems, Daddy pulled me over to the sink with the pint and the quart jar, and he had me take a cup and how many cups are in a pint, how many cups are in a quart, how many pints are in a quart.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would pour water in, and then we would make the different ways, and then I would go, oh, and that gave me an experience of hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a lot of things that I did in my classroom as I taught hands-on.
Mm-hmm.
So in this book, I've got the actual pictures of showing 2 cups and 4 cups and 2 pints and the quarts and all. And when I go and read to the children, I have a quart and I have a pint, and I show them the difference of them. I have a picture of the potato masher. I have a picture of the funnel. I have a picture of the ladle, and talk about each one of those things so that they know. I have a picture of cheesecloth. I'm looking to go and get some real cheesecloth, so next time I have that also. So I'm working at making it as much a teaching lesson with my book, as well as giving them inspiration to do their own writing.
Since we're talking about encouraging the writer in you, we also need to talk about the naysayers, because it's important to understand you will always have naysayers.
Oh, yes.
And you need to identify the naysayer and push them to the side. You don't want to let anyone discourage you. You want them to encourage you. So if you find someone who's discouraging you and saying, you don't have the background for this, you don't have the education for this, why would you write about that? You know nothing about it. Those are the friends or the associates you want to push to the side and listen. So, what are you doing now? Oh, that sounds interesting. Let me help you with that. Or maybe did you go here and look? You want those people to help you.
Absolutely.
And everyone needs to understand there will always be naysayers.
You know, and I think because of the fact that I am such a positive person that I ignore them.
Good
I
idea.
just totally ignore them and find some way around to do something different, you know. And I have a friend, a very dear friend, who, after I write something, she's my first editor before it goes to the real editor.
Yeah.
You know, so that she can go, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Or maybe you want to re-look at this, you know. And so that gives me more. And you know what, boys and girls especially, you cannot write something the first time and expect it to be right.
Right.
You have to write it over and over, and that's called a rough draft. And that was one of the hardest things for second graders to understand. Once they wrote it, I'm finished. And so I had to
That's true.
convince them.
Even for adult writers.
Even
that's
in
hard to
writing an
understand.
email.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Brenda, you're right. Or Rhonda, I'm sorry. Rhonda, you're right. Absolutely.
Yes. And so therefore, you know, I would go, oh, well, let's look at this. And then the next thing we'd know was we never used a red pen. They could choose any other color,
Oh, that's
but
cool.
we never used a red
idea.
Yeah,
pen
I like
Great
that idea
idea.
too.
because if they wanted purple or pink or yellow, whatever color they wanted to use, we would use that color. And I had pens galore that they could choose each time of what they wanted to do.
Right, because we're so used to seeing the negative in red.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made sure that red was never used in my classroom. I used green, I used pink, I used blue. Blue's my favorite color, and purple. And so I would do that, and then they would choose the color that they wanted me to make their corrections in.
Mm.
So they would be able to, pick.
I know someone who critiques books, and one of the things I liked about him, or like about him, is that he never gives anyone below a 3.
Oh.
And the reason for that
Mm-hmm.
is because he's an author as well. And knowing how much effort and work went into writing that book, he goes, it always has to be at least average. It can't be anything below that because you put your heart and soul in it. And then he would do constructive criticism along the side. You might want to look at this or the way you structure things, or there are things he'll do to encourage you to continue or rework it, but he never ever slams it. And I think of all of our contests and all these things, if you look at TV today, on these singing award shows or talent shows,
Right.
you've got some people who want to be bad. That's their whole MO, is to critique and be bad. And some people say, well, yeah, but you need to hear the negative. Well, you kind of need to hear the criticism, but there's ways of criticizing
Yes.
without being
Constructive
brutal.
criticism.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that's a
yes.
technique. That's really difficult to do. That's much harder to do it that way than it is to just be cruel. That's easy.
Oh, yeah.
So
You are correct.
you always want to, look for the encouragement. Always steer away from anyone who's trying to discourage you. My first novel that came out, I actually knew someone who told me, you'll never be an author. You don't have the
Oh,
education
my.
for it. You don't have the background that you need to become an author. And sometimes, in some ways, it does encourage you because now you're saying, I'm proving that person wrong. And that's when you start looking for the people who will encourage you. And I think that's exactly what I did. I started leaning towards the people who said, this is good, this is great, you need to continue with this. So then you weigh what's more important, the person who's saying, I like this is good, keep going, or the
Yes.
person who's saying, yeah, you don't have the background for this, you
That's
really can't
right.
do this.
That's right.
And I'm going to tell you why it's important to look for the person who is encouraging you. It doesn't matter what your educational background is. I know an author who became very well known, and her syntax was horrible. She's from the South as well. And she wrote in freehand, and she had a friend of hers, another author, read it. No one wanted to read her work, first of all, because it was in a spiral-bound notebook. She didn't use a computer.
Oh.
But this person just decided, I'm going to take a look at it. Loved this book, sent it to an editor in New York. Of course, someone typed it up. It was ended up being made into 2 different movies for Lifetime. There were 2 different books she wrote eventually, and they were both made into movies for Lifetime. So that's why you can't let people discourage you. If you have an idea or you have something you can convey and put on paper, we have editors for that. We have people who can help you round out the edges, That's what they're there for.
Mm-hmm.
So don't let anyone discourage you from trying to do something.
And that's exactly how I feel that I've been able to go on, is I've had my friends and my parents at one time. The way that I really got started in writing was there was a contest, and my mother sent the contest to me, and she said, I want you to try this. And so I did, and what you did is if you won, you got 6 free lessons in the college that the test was in, and so I won. So I had 6 lessons on how to improve and how to learn to make your character more light,
Develop it.
develop it
Yeah.
and make it more lifelike, and to be able to take your plot and to make it have more depth and meaning. So I had those kind of background, and then teaching writing, and then I took classes at UNLV and Leslie College was where I ended up getting my master's, and we did things that were a lot of movement, a lot of getting the kids involved in their writing and then acting it out and using movement. If they wrote about a tree, then they were the tree. If they wrote about an animal, then they were the animal. And it really helped to let them see what they could do, what they could feel, how they could act. And so maybe we would do something and they would, for example, we did pandas one year with Japan. And so each of the kids made their own panda. And then they wrote a story about the panda. And then they acted out being the panda, and then they would go back and go, oh, I want to change. I said, now you're starting to do your rough draft. That's your first rough draft. Now let's start your second. And so then they would go back and they'd say, oh, well, I remember when I acted this out, the panda moved this way on all fours, or he sat there and ate bamboo after bamboo because, they can eat 30 pounds in an hour and still be hungry. And so that's the way that I encourage them, by teaching them how to find their way through movement, through acting, through making, and developed.
And even as adults, we do that. I mean, people go to seminars. As adults, we'll go to seminars.
Yes.
Or we'll go to readings with our own work. I think the greatest lessons I've ever had wasn't always in the classroom. I've probably learned more going through the editing process with the various books I've worked on, because I also have written for several other people, not just myself. So I've learned so much just from the editors. And it's automatic, because if they send something back to you and they say, you need to do this, don't you use that word too many times, you become more and more aware of what you're supposed to do and what you shouldn't do. So we become better writers the more we write and the more we do. So education has nothing to do with it, and that's why you can't let people discourage you from doing something. Like I said, always look for the person who's the most encouraging in your life.
Yes. Well, I am involved in the Institute of Children's Literature, which is a program where I watch podcasts on the computer. And they're different authors, and they tell about the way that they developed and how they wrote this, or how they had a writer's block and this is how they got over it, and things like that, which has helped me a lot also.
Right, because you were participating and watching so you could teach someone else. A lot of times people don't understand as well. It's okay later on in life, do seminars. Learn from the masters, take that information, absorb it, teach it to someone else.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I enjoyed so much when I was a teacher, and a little while after I was a teacher. I worked with children and went to school and read, and then we would, make a journal, or we would write about their experience instead of Aggie's. So Aggie is named after my grandmother. Okay. Her name was Agnes. And instead of using Rhonda, I decided to use Aggie. But everybody else in this story, that's their real name. Mama, Daddy, Roger, my brother, and Papa, and Granny. So, but Aggie took on a new meaning because it made it even more personable because it was Granny's name.
Yeah, and in The Purple Caterpillar, I actually used the name of the people I used to work with. So all those names they're not made up. And in my mind, it's so funny because even when you're developing the characters, even though they're basically cartoon type characters, you still try to visualize it in a way that's like their personality.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And you know, one of the things that both you and Rhonda have talked about a lot is the fact that when you encourage the writer within you, you also have to do a good part of reading, because a good writer is a good reader.
Mm-hmm.
And both of you have talked about, especially with children, you read, especially in a good variety of reading, you get to know what other writers are writing. And you develop that sense in yourself. You know, you might be a fiction writer or you might be a romance writer, but if you branch out and you read other things, it might stimulate a memory in you that you never thought you had. And by reading, you get to a point where, oh, yeah, I could write like that. I could write this thing that I'm reading that you never thought you could.
I think my reading, for the most part, in the last few years, has been more about authors because I'm interviewing authors.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll have to go and read a synopsis, or I'll have to go and read a biography or whatever. So I'm not so much into the novels anymore as I am to reading about people.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things you learn, even when someone sends me a what's it called, resume, and or a press release, I notice the different styles in those as well.
Oh, yes.
From author to author, or from PR person to PR person. I mean, it's amazing how different we all write.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I pick up anything from that or not. I'm sure I do. But it is interesting how you can evaluate people based on what you're reading, just little things.
Well, some of them probably come in and say, this is the greatest person that ever walked on water. Another one might come in and say, well, you know, if he butters his bread today, it might be a great feat because he doesn't really get out of bread or out of bed or out of whatever. Other person says, well, he might need encouragement because he's kind of shy. You know, you can probably pick up who he is by the resume.
Oh, I
that
absolutely,
comes in.
and that's exactly why I do that as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's one of the things I like doing in life is encouraging people. That's what this show is all about.
Course. Yeah.
I've had so many authors, their first interviews been on this show.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I feel proud of that because,
Of
you know,
course.
I think every person is important. I don't care if you've sold 2 million copies of a book or you haven't sold your first book yet. You know, to me, that person who hasn't sold their first book is just as important as that person who sold 2 million copies. So, you know, and I hope that that's what everyone out there does is encourage, you know, the writer in someone.
Mm-hmm.
We have a gentleman that I don't know if you've interviewed him or not, Christopher Lakin, who was in, he's in Great Britain. He's in London. And when his first book came out, he took a little bit of, I guess you'd say jabs or criticism, and was trying to figure out how do I handle all of this. Over there, their system's a little different, and then if you're going to go into a school system and read a book, they have to do a complete background, vetting background, to make sure that you're not, you know, a predator or, you know, and, you know, they check everything about you. And, you know, the process is arduous, and he didn't know if he wanted to go through all that or not. I mean, you make a determination. If I'm going to get my book out there, I have to. You don't have to. You have to do it. So all these things that we have to go through, it's really worth it. And I encourage you to just stick to the, you know, what's it called? Stick to the straight and narrow. Just don't look back. Just keep going. You'll get there. It all seems difficult in the beginning, but once you get past certain things, it's very easy. When you did your first book signing, well, first of all, when was your first book signing?
My first book with Granny's Cobbler was in 2016, in December. That's when it came out.
And what was that like for you?
Oh, it was so exciting, but
good.
terrifying
Okay.
also.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
You know, I was excited. I was at Barnes & Noble, and I read the book, and I read the whole book. And so the kids sat there. They listened to everything. Everything was just wonderful. And then no one bought the book because they heard the whole book.
I know. I did that recently at a festival. I would let the kids come up and read the book, and then they didn't want to buy it because they already read it.
Yeah. So when I was at Barnes & Noble last weekend, I stopped just at the part where I
Right
said,
where it gets good.
that's right,
Yes.
where Aggie gets purple hands. Now, if you want to know what happens, you'll have
That's
to
right.
buy the book.
That's right.
That's cool. That's cool. And I think that's why a lot of times people will just do readings where you're only reading like one chapter or two chapters, and that's to encourage whoever's there to pick up the book.
And you hear people in the audience say, wait, you can't stop there. You got to tell me the rest.
And I had kids that did that too.
Yeah.
And then they go, Mama, I need that book. And of course, sometimes they bought it and sometimes they didn't.
Yeah. I look back at all those things. It doesn't seem like it's been that long ago, but I published my first book in '95, and there are interesting things that can happen with this too, and we are talking about encouragement. When you go out there and do book signings, you may not always sell a book.
That's
But you
right.
can't let that discourage you, because you may not sell a book at all, or sell one book one time, and the next book sell 27, sell 50. I mean, you never know what's going to happen next. So you can't let anything discourage you. Because I've attended a few festivals here in Las Vegas, and I actually have produced 2 myself. And people always say, "Well, I really didn't sell that many books." And then I'm thinking, but if you sold 1 or 2, you've got at least 2 new readers out there who
That's
will
right.
talk about what they've read. So, you always want to think of in that terms. It's not so much how many I sold, it's who did you influence today?
And you're exposed out there.
Mhm.
You've got your name out there. Everybody is going, oh, Aggie's purple hands.
Mhm.
I had a lady come up to me and she goes, I read your book. And I said, you did? She says, yeah, it was back there on the shelf. So I just picked it up and read it. I said, did you buy it? Oh, no, I didn't need to. I finished it.
Right,
know?
yeah.
So, but she liked it,
You know what's cool though about that is because you never know who they might tell about the book.
That is true.
And someone can live here and they can hear the whole story, but then if they are talking about with a friend back in Kansas or back in New Jersey or wherever, they'll go and buy that book online or wherever they can pick it up, at a bookstore or whatever. So, you can't let that discourage you either.
Right.
That's actually a great thing.
That's true. I got an email from a lady, and she goes, my grandparents live in Hartford, Alabama. Where can I buy your book?
See?
And I said, well, you can get it from me, or you can go on Amazon, or you can go in Barnes & Noble. There's several places you can get it. And she lived in Wetumpka, Alabama, which was on the other side of Montgomery. And Hartford is close to the Florida line. And so, that was in itself. And I was talking to a lady on Kindle, and she was trying to help me with a problem I was having with my book. And so she was in my Kindle with me. And I said, do you see that book right there? And she goes, oh, you wrote that book? I've got to get that book for my granddaughter.
There you go.
And she did.
Oh, that's
you know?
cool.
So that kind of thing, happens all the time.
So you
That's
let
right.
people encourage you. You
Absolutely.
open
That's
your
right.
receptives to that.
That's right.
Yes.
All right, we're down to the last minute of the show, and so our guest has been Rhonda Gatlin. And Rhonda, why don't you tell us where we can find your work?
You can find my work at Barnes & Noble. You can find it online at Amazon.com. You can also get it by writing me at Rhonda K. Gatlin, gmail@gmail.com. And also you can, Books A Million also has it down there in the South.
Okay, and you'll also have a blog post?
I have a blog post.
Okay.
It's RhondaKGatlin.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Joyce, where can we find your work?
Yes, my most recent one is Ripples in the Generations, but I have a couple of sites. It's linesoflistening.com. I also have a blog, which is linesoflisteningblog.wordpress.com, which is dedicated to health and wellness. You can also find all of my books on Amazon.com, and it's also available on the Barnes & Noble's Nook.
All right. Well, you can go to aspectsofwriting.com to learn more about Rhonda. And you'll see that we're syndicated on amfm247.com. Our show airs at 1 o'clock Pacific Standard Time on amfm247.com. And we're syndicated on 14 terrestrial stations. If you just go to aspectsofwriting.com, you can click on links to where those stations are located. We are also on Roku Television. We're on iHeartRadio and probably about a couple dozen other outlets. So just go to aspectsofwriting.com to learn more, or amfm247.com. When you go there, just click on the Aspects of Writing show. And until next week, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, Rhonda, for being on the show.
Thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Joyce.
having me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.